Hi everyone, Amy here. I just wanted to give you all some feedback midweek on our quote and paraphrase discussion for the second week of our semester this summer. Just a couple of quick administrative things before we get started. Please don't forget to check out my final comments on last week's discussion, which are posted here in the news as well as within the discussion itself, so you could just link to that by clicking here. And also, if you're just checking in for the first time this week, which you shouldn't because you've already had some deadlines this week already, but if you are, don't forget to also scroll down and check out your to-do list for the week, which can also be found under this week's module in content. Okay, so let's go into our week 2 discussion first. You guys are doing a really good job so far, and I was glad to see that some of you talked about the Dawn of the Digital Natives article, and some of you talked about the Twitter article, so we can get some coverage of both of the articles that you should have read thus far, and we will have one more article for next week to read, and then those are the 3 that you can choose from for your summary essay. So here are the prompts that I was asking you to execute. I think for the most part everybody did a pretty good job. Some of you struggled a little bit more than others to accurately identify the thesis or main idea of the article that you chose. However, almost all of you did a really good job with the attributive tags, and I really thought you all provided some insightful reflection for this fourth prompt here about what the process was like, and especially the part about which was easier, quoting or paraphrasing. So I'll have some comments to touch on for all of these different parts of the activity as we get into our 5 minutes of fame here. So I'll just start by addressing the first part of the activity, which is where I asked you to identify the thesis or main idea of the article that you chose to summarize. So I wanted to pull one out for both of the articles, an example out for both articles. I think that more of you struggled with the Dawn of the Digital Natives article than with the Twitter article. I think most people accurately identified the thesis of the Twitter article, but for the Dawn of the Digital Natives article, most of you did not actually identify the overall thesis accurately. So I wanted to provide some intervention there, I guess we could say. So, and also talk about why I think that is a confusing article to summarize. So the thing about Dawn of the Digital Natives is he starts out talking about the NEA study, but the NEA study is not Johnson's argument. In fact, Johnson's argument goes up against the NEA study, and he kind of makes a claim that is directly contrary to what the NEA is saying is happening in terms of literacy rates among young people today. And so Johnson says that, in fact, literacy is not on the decline, but rather young people today are among the most literate, least violent generation in decades, and that their success does correlate with their technological literacy. Now, many of you identified the point about the correlation between success and technological literacy. However, I want to emphasize that that in and of itself does not encompass the entire thesis or the entire main idea of Johnson's overall argument. So remember from your text that the thesis must be comprehensive of everything in the text, of everything in the argument. It is the most broad part of that text structure of thesis, reasons, and evidence. It's the least specific. It's kind of the overall umbrella that encompasses everything else that he says in the article. So even though it's true that he does say that success correlates with information and technology literacy, he is only using that as one point to support an overall larger argument about literacy rates among young people today, which is directly in contradiction to what the NEA has said about the decline in reading among young people today. So here's an example that I pulled out. This person said, Stephen Johnson, author of Dawn of the Digital Natives, stated, certainly there is every reason to believe that technological literacy correlates strongly with professional success in the information age. That's the quote. And then the person says, this encompasses the thesis of the article because he's refuting the belief that the lack of reading books is damaging the success of our society. And so I pulled out this particular example because, for one thing, several of you pulled out this exact same quote for his thesis, but I also wanted to bring this example out because the second sentence here is actually paraphrase in this student's own words, and it does a much better job getting at the overall, more broad, general main idea of Johnson's argument. And so this kind of speaks to what several of you already have highlighted in your comments to each other, which is that sometimes it's easier to express the main idea of something when you get to put it in your own words, because rarely do writers come right out and say exactly word for word what their main idea or overall thesis is. So when you're trying to find a particular sentence to quote, sometimes it's impossible because that sentence doesn't even exist. And so I think that's what we see here with several of you choosing this quote here, is maybe it is close. Maybe it is getting at what his overall argument is. But really there's a broader point that he's making here, which this student has much more effectively summed up in their own words and kind of positioning that argument in refutation of the NEA study's overall claim. And so I think what you could actually do is flip this around to better follow that argument structure of thesis, reasons, and evidence to say, okay, here's his thesis, and here's one of his reasons to support that thesis. And then he cites all kinds of evidence on both sides, the NEA study, his own statistics about declining rates of violence and things like that. So anything specific and factual, that's going to be the evidence that you would leave out of your overall thesis, but your thesis can encompass the overall main idea and then any reasons to support that main idea. So if this person said, this encompasses the thesis of the article, or the thesis of the article is refuting the belief that the lack of reading books is damaging the success of our society because technological literacy correlates strongly with professional success in the information age. And so I do think this is an accurate statement that is something he says in the article, but to me it's not the thesis because it's more one of the reasons to support his overall thesis, which is more something along the lines of what we see here. And then I just do want to point out that there were one or two of you who did accurately identify the thesis of that article. So if you are trying to summarize the Dawn of the Digital Natives article and you feel like you need an example of an accurate paraphrase, I think Hillary did a pretty good job. Although she's kind of attributing it to Crane, when Hillary, you should be attributing this to Johnson himself, and try to stay away from any of the specific evidence that he uses to support his points in the thesis. But down here where you say, even though the Google generation spends more time on the internet rather than reading books, we're actually getting smarter contrary to the published studies of the NEA. That to me was the best paraphrase I saw of the thesis of this article in the discussion. It just needs to be attributed to Johnson instead. And then I also thought that Peter did a pretty good job with that as well. So take a look at what he says here, particularly in his paraphrase section about the fact that the NEA study doesn't account for any reading. People write in multiple genres, and it's an incomplete claim. This is a little long-winded for a thesis. I'd like it to be more succinct, and maybe you don't need all these different specific examples. You could say that in a more concise way, but in general this is accurate, and it gets at that main idea and all the supporting points, and so it is comprehensive of that overall argument. And then, like I said, you guys did a much better job picking out the thesis of the Twitter article. So I wanted to just pull out one example of someone who did that rather effectively here. In the article, How Twitter Will Change the Way We Live for Time Magazine by Stephen Johnson, Johnson shares his surprise at Twitter's magnitude. Yes, the breakfast status updates turned out to be more interesting than we thought, but the key development with Twitter is how we've jury-rigged the system to do things that its creators never dreamed of. This sentence encompasses the main idea of the entire article, the adoption of Twitter and its revolutionary effects. So I did say that it's very hard to find a specific sentence in an article that encompasses the true thesis, but I would say that this one is pretty close. To be truly comprehensive and a true thesis, you would need all the main points in here, supporting reasons, when really there's just one, but this in particular is the overall claim, and several of you were able to pull that out, so I was glad to see. There are lots of reasons why Twitter is maybe more deep or offers more substance than we originally thought, But the biggest thing that Johnson talks about is the way that the users have innovated to make it more useful and more popular, and that's really allowed it to take off. So most of you did come up with some version of that. I just pulled out this example because I thought it was particularly effective. Okay, and then I also wanted to pull out a couple of the things that you guys were able to come up with for that fourth reflection question part of the activity, because I thought there were some really insightful things that you guys said there. So this person said, I found that while it's easier to use direct quotes, paraphrasing the quote let me explore my understanding of it. It was a process that let me get a bit creative and express what I read in my own words. I believe that using one method over the other will vary depending on the text and genre of the summary. So I was really glad to see this person kind of highlighting some of the benefits of both, when it's good to paraphrase or when it's good to quote. I was also pleased to see that most of you identified that you preferred paraphrase. Paraphrase is usually the preferred method because it does retain your own voice. But you know, there are times when it's appropriate to quote as well, and I think you guys came up with some good examples of those. And then I was also pleased to see this writer trying to apply some of the rhetorical language, or some of the language of the rhetorical situation, saying that one method versus the other the benefits will vary depending on the text and genre of the summary. So I just want to clarify, summary is one genre form. So basically you could just rephrase this to say depending on the genre of the text. And so when the genre of the text is summary, you know, you probably want to make sure that you paraphrase in an accurate way, but that you do paraphrase to show that you really understood it. Because if you just have a bunch of quotes in your summary, it doesn't show me that you understood. It just shows me that you can use quotation marks and copy something down word for word. On the other hand, if you're trying to evaluate a text in maybe like an analysis or a response, something that goes beyond summary, that genre you would maybe want to include some credentials or some evaluation of the quote or paraphrase, in which case you might want to quote it directly just to give yourself a little bit more credibility, as I think someone brought up in one of their comments. So some really insightful things there, and I appreciated those thoughts. And then this person said, after rereading the sentences that use the quote method and the paraphrase method, I feel like the paraphrase method sounded more natural and read easier than the quote method. That being said, if you feel that the direct quote of the author is important, or if you're writing to a critical audience who are trying to establish your credentials, you'd be better off using the quote method. Also, in using the attributive tag, I was able to add some background information about the credentials and possible biases of the author. Both methods felt natural, and I feel comfortable using either one depending on the situation. So this is just exactly what I was kind of trying to get at before. You know, when you're summarizing, it is better to paraphrase, but if you're writing a more critical essay, it might be better to quote, just like this person says. And then also want to highlight that you do need to use an attributive tag in both cases, regardless of whether you are quoting or paraphrasing. And if your paraphrase goes on for multiple sentences, then you need multiple attributive tags in basically every single sentence that you pull from the text. Even when you put it in your own words. And then if we have just a few more minutes, I pulled out a couple of the comments that you provided to each other, because I've already started to see some good conversations going, and hopefully those will continue over the next few days as we wrap up the discussion this week. I like these comments that I pulled out because they offer some feedback. They also push the conversation in a new direction, and they ask questions, which kind of invites an engagement from both parties in the discussion. So this person says, you know, I too liked using the paraphrase method over quotes. While I think quotes have an important role in writing, it seems more natural to paraphrase someone else's words. I believe writing is more fun when you get to insert your own voice and opinion. However, certain papers, such as the summary, don't allow the latter. Very good. It'll be interesting in the process of writing the paper to establish the line between still having your own voice and keeping your opinion out. Do you think it will be easy or difficult? This is really insightful, because I do want you to paraphrase in the summary, but you do have to remain objective. So be careful that you are not interpreting or evaluating in any way, and that you choose neutral verbs for your attributive tags and not something that's going to convey some kind of emotion. And then this person said, as I read your discussion posting, I noticed that the initial quote you chose was pretty long. In previous English classes I've completed, my teachers always told me to keep the quote shorter, with one sentence as the maximum length. What was your thought process to determine that the quote you used was best suited for the thesis or main idea? So I don't think a quote just has to be one sentence. If it goes on for more than 4 sentences, you do kind of want to separate it out into what we call a block quote. But as far as the thesis goes, it should just be a couple of sentences that encompass the overall main idea. So very insightful there. Okay, thanks everyone. Keep up the